women as individuals, men and women as groups, men and women as two halves of one species, love, sex, envy, hate, fairness, unfairness, confusion, fear, anger, appreciation, resentment. If everything is relative, what can be more relative than relations between the sexes? Every week, your host, Jack Kammer, talks with a man or a woman on the podcasts Men Are Talking or Goodwill Toward Men, and aims to deliver at least one idea that will make you think, wow, I never thought of it like that. Today, Jack talks with a man on Men Are Talking.
Why is there so much suspicion, division, and distrust between gay men and heterosexual men? That's the main question up for discussion in this episode of Men Are Talking. We talk with John Lauritsen, a longtime gay rights activist and a fierce critic of feminist censorship of what men, gay and straight, say and publish about gender issues. Hello, John Lauritsen.
Hello, Jack Kammer.
Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time. I'm looking forward to a good conversation. You and I have agreed to a pretty long list of things we want to talk about. So I guess we sort of should get right into it. Before we get to that long list, though, I do want to talk with you a bit about your career. Do I understand it correctly that your career was primarily as a survey research analyst?
Well, I had a checkered career. I mean, I always, from an early stage, it was writing also, but I supported myself basically in market research, survey research.
Aha. Okay. Very good. So not in academia, but more in business then.
Well, I mean, my academia consisted of Harvard as an undergraduate, and that's the end of it. I never really considered teaching.
Okay, very good. But I mean, your survey research was primarily in the corporate world rather than scientific research. Is that right?
That's true, although market research is sort of looking at one hand towards academia and the other towards the business world.
Yeah. Well, it is a science. It's a science put to the use of business.
Well, science and art. I mean, it's...
It's an inexact science.
Right, not entirely clear-cut.
Okay, very good. So I wanted to ask you, does your experience in that field give you any thoughts about the statement that was popularized by Mark Twain about lies, damn lies, and statistics?
Well, it gave me an understanding. I mean, of course, you can lie using pseudo-statistics, but when you're in professional survey research, you don't lie because the corporations that you're doing the research for want to know the truth. So if they have a new product, you want to tell them whether it will be a bomb or a grand success. They have to know. And your own reputation can, depends on telling the truth.
And they might come looking for you if they sunk $500 million into a product you said was going to be great and it turned out to fall flat.
Yeah, exactly. Oh.
Okay, very good. You are an independent scholar at this point in your life. Is that right?
Well, I'm independent in the sense that I have never been in academia, except as an undergraduate.
And so,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, that means that I'm not beholden to reputations of senior people. I mean, I can tell the truth. My experience in, the Frankenstein thing, we can get into that, showed that junior people in academia, junior professors and graduate students are absolutely terrified of falling, getting into trouble with the senior people. They don't dare tell the truth if it jeopardizes anyone's reputation.
And so, as an independent scholar, you are free to tell the truth as you see it. And you have felt free in your career or over the past decades to talk a lot about gender issues and gay issues, which can be very polarizing. But you are free to speak your mind.
Free, except free speech is not all that free. I mean, I've taken like really hard knocks in a number of ways for telling the truth. They would include even death threats from the mob, which was telling the truth about a recreational drug known as poppers or nitride inhalants, which were the popular drug among gay men for many years, and to some extent still are. And I and my colleague Hank Wilson wrote about this for several years and finally published a little book called Death Rush, Poppers and AIDS. And it was mostly an annotated bibliography of medical reports showing how really harmful poppers were to the health. But both Hank Wilson and I, my colleague in San Francisco, received death threats from the mob, and we had to decide what to do. And our decision was simply to keep going, but to be as public as possible, where the mob would feel that they had more to lose than to gain if they were to kill us.
So was the mob here simply people who liked and advocated for others to enjoy poppers, or the manufacturers of poppers who stood to gain financially from the sale of them?
Well, I say the mob. I mean, of course, poppers, the original poppers were amyl nitride, a drug that was used to treat a temporary episode of heart pain. But the mob used other drugs that were closely related, like butyl nitride, isobutyl nitride, and so on. But they were by no means a legitimate pharmaceutical company, to say the least. But the public health service was in cahoots with the popper manufacturers. James Curran, the head of the CDC, issued a statement which virtually told gay men that it was safe to use poppers and they might as well go ahead. And that was not at all the case. Yeah. And
did you and your collaborator come up with the thought that in some way poppers compromised the immune system and contributed, not necessarily causing, but contributed to the development of AIDS?
Yes, we did. The title of our book was called Death Rush, Poppers and AIDS, but it was by no means the idea that poppers were the main cause. But by then, this was before HIV, the virus that's claimed to cause AIDS, even had a name. And there was, open speculation as to what the causes might be. That shifted once the announcement was made, that the cause was discovered, and censorship set in, very intense. But at this point, I would say that poppers are the only tenable hypothesis for why some gay men were getting one form of Kaposi's sarcoma, which was once the hallmark disease in AIDS indicator disease. AIDS is a whole other topic, but my view is simply that AIDS is a construct, and that in reality, different people and different groups of people are getting sick in different ways and for different reasons. And that gets complicated, but the most simple of all is the users of heroin injected. And they were getting sick and still are in exactly the same way they were 100 years ago. And it was very well studied in the early 20th century. which is to say their health deteriorates and they die from lung disease. And that's to be expected because heroin does destroy the health in general and especially compromises the lungs, which all of the opiates and opioids do, which is why codeine, for example, was put into a cough syrup because it, suppressed the lungs. But that's a whole other topic.
Well, it is a whole nother topic, but this whole discussion we've had so far is really by way of establishing that John Lauritsen is a man of integrity, and he speaks the truth even when it's not comfortable, convenient, or popular.
Well, I would like to think so. For example, I've been involved in the gay liberation movement from the very beginning, and even before that, I was to some extent in the homophile movement before 1969. And I've done a great deal of reading and a lot of writing, but my main idea is that the condemnation of sex between males is a theological phenomenon, going back to the holiness code of Leviticus, about 500 or 600 years BC. And this was not popular. All of the good gay scholars, the ones that, like to get along with the establishment, did not like the idea of in effect, blaming religion. And at a forum that I and two of my colleagues gave on a book by John Boswell, one after another of the good gay scholars attacked us in the discussion period. And they said things like, don't you understand? We can't persuade people if we're going to attack religion. And my idea was not whether we should or should not attack religion. It was simply what is the historical truth of why sex between males is condemned.
Very good. Okay. Now we will get into that in a little bit. I want to establish your bona fides in the homophile movement and in the gay, what should we call it, gay liberation movement?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned 1969, and Stonewall was at the end of June of 1969. So you were either at Stonewall or in New York City active right after Stonewall.
Well, I lived in Manhattan, about half a mile from Stonewall. I was not part of the riots, although I observed them with my lover at the time. The police did not allow us even to get into a certain area of Greenwich Village. But anyway, I joined the Gay Liberation Front in about the second week of July. So I was one of the very earliest members of the New York Gay Liberation Front. Before that, when I lived in Boston, I occasionally attended meetings of the Boston Mattachine Society. They had lectures and so on. And I knew quite well Prescott Townsend, who was the main homophile force in Boston. And later, after Stonewall, I got to know many of the older homophile leaders. All of them are dead now, but this was include W. Dorleg, Jim Kepner, people like that.
Okay, very good. So the way I found you, first came across you, was when I was writing an article in 1992 for the magazine Quill, a magazine for journalists. And I came across, the idea of this article was to talk about the need to tell the truth about what's going on in gender issues, because journalists are supposed to tell the truth. And I came across a statement from you at the Gay Academic Union in 1976. And I want to read this quote from you and ask you to comment on it. It has become almost taboo to criticize anyone who identifies herself as a feminist. Why have feminists enjoyed this virtual immunity from criticism? Because feminists have so often demanded that things they disagree with be censored and have so often gotten their way that some men, frankly, are afraid of them. You want to comment on where that was coming from?
Well, I would still agree with it. The speech I gave at the Gay Academic Union, it was the last major meeting of the Gay Academic Union, was in response to my experiences in the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activist Alliance, and the Gay Academic Union, where women would come in and act in ways that were extremely destructive. And I would not blame women in general, or even women's liberationists in general. I mean, to me, the main thing is that they were women demanding, censorship, basically.
What kind of ideas were they demanding censorship of?
Well, that's hard to tell. I mean, to some extent, they weren't even ideas at all, but anything that was pro-male to them was anathema. You can say that for sure. Some of them were openly anti-gay, and amazingly, gay men did not pick up on it because they thought they had to support, our sisters. In the speech I gave, which is available on the internet, I go into things like Kate Millett, who was very, very anti-gay in her main book. There's no doubt about it. She was a, complete muddlehead. Her ideas don't come across clearly, but there's unmistakably she's opposed to gay men.
How is she about lesbians?
I'm sorry, what?
How is she about lesbians?
Well, she was a lesbian herself, apparently, but no, lesbians are never criticized.
And the criticism of gay men was not about their gayness, but about their maleness?
Well, the main thing with the whole idea of male lovers, sex between males, it wasn't, about identity so much as simply, well, and it goes beyond simply sex between males. So almost any good relationship between males to them was anathema.
Because if men get together, they become dangerous? Is that the idea?
Well, yes. Yes and no. I mean, we're in the middle of a war against man and against maleness, as you know, and it goes far beyond. Well, I would say it's simply a war against men having spaces where they could be together, and that includes a whole lot. I mean, I attended a male college, and I'm happy that I did. There are no more male colleges left, except a few rabbinical colleges. All of the Ivy League male colleges have gone co-ed. However, there are still women's colleges, and almost half of the Seven Sisters, which were the female equivalent of the Ivy League colleges, are still for women only. The YMCA is now for both, males and females, but the YWCA is for females only. Here in Boston, several years ago, I did a sort of a telephone survey. And as far as I could tell, there's not one single gym for males only, but there were maybe a dozen gyms for women only. So this is a double standard. One thing that comes close to home here in South Boston is something called the Curley Center. And it was built in 1930. And it's a big complex. It's on Dorchester Bay, and it has 3 beaches, which are separate. There was a men's beach at L Street, a women's beach, and what was once a boys' beach, although that became a public beach. But they're quite big, and each of the beaches would be, I would say, about maybe 120 yards or so, or maybe more. And I first went to the L Street Beach in about 1960, and it was hundreds of males sunbathing, most of them nude, which you were not supposed to do. But there was a man who came by, an older man called the pecker checker. And if you were nude, he had a stick with a little feather at the end of it, and he would tickle you. He never said anything, but that meant you were supposed to throw a towel over yourself. And as soon as he went, then the towel would be thrown off. But anyway, the Curley Center not only had an all-male beach, but also a solarium, which was wonderful in the cold months. And there was also a women's solarium. But now, because of the shutdown, the COVID shutdown, they're renovating it. And once it's renovated, there will be no more gender-specific spaces. No more men's beach, no more women's beach, no more men's solarium. And I think this is a great loss. I mean, yeah.
Yes. Okay. We're going to jump into another little quote that I have from you that I want to talk about. Before I do that, I want to ask you, do you have perhaps a pen in your hand that you might be tapping on the table? Because I'm hearing taps. Are you tapping in any? No, you're not tapping in any way?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Well, we're hearing taps, and not coming from me, not coming from John. Maybe it's the mob.
No, I have no idea.
Okay. Well, we'll just have to ask our listeners to please put up with it. So the other quote on point here was that you mentioned by email to me a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks ago, that you have been brooding over the lack of a voice for male love, which I define as including love, sex, and friendship. And so the first question I would like to ask you is, of those three things, love, sex, and friendship, are they all independent of each other? Can they exist independently and in not unlimited, but in all of the permutations?
Well, that definition of male love is not original with me. Others like Benedict Friedlander in the early German movement used that. But I would say they're different aspects of one and the same phenomenon. But in an individual relationship, only one of them could be present, or two or three. And it's hard to say what's ideal. I mean, I've been in a relationship where we were lovers, had sex, we were friends, and it was lovely. But you can also have a relationship which is simply pure sex, and that can be great and enjoyable. It can be like playing a game of ping pong with someone, or a game of gin rummy. You don't have to like them or love them. It's the game.
So does that type of relationship that you just mentioned, does that relate at all to the idea of being on the down low that you hear is often the way Black men describe such sex?
Well, I don't know. I mean, to me, that's sort of another issue.
Yeah. Okay. But the term down low would not be applied to. No, well, actually, the term down low typically is used by Black men who say they are not gay at all, but they just enjoy the game of sex with men.
Well, in that sense, it's a legitimate thing. I mean, I consider virtually all males potentially capable of enjoying sex with other males. And that can be shown, for example, in any number of things where you have an all-male group where there's opportunity and permission, like prison. And it isn't merely that the prisoners have sex with each other for want of anything better. they thoroughly enjoy, male sex is male sex. And actually, the prisoners that are most active in gay sex in prison, once they're out of prison, tend to be the most heterosexually active, whatever that means.
So we will get into that line of questioning that I have in mind in just a minute. Before we do, I want to follow up on this idea of brooding over the lack of a voice for male love. What's bad about it?
Well, it's a lack of publications that would favor the viewpoint of gay men, male love. In fact, there are very few publications but that are good at all. But they're for both, lesbians and gay men, not to mention transsexuals and all the rest of it. Early on in the 70s, following Stonewall, for a while there was a marvelous proliferation of gay publications, gay radio shows, and all of that. But I don't see any of it now.
So in your statement that I quoted a minute or two ago, you talked about a lack of a voice for male love, which you define as including love, sex, and friendship. Do you see male love between straight men and gay men that does not involve sex, but just involves love and friendship?
Well, yes, yeah. The definition of what a straight man is problematic. I mean, to me, it's simply negative, meaning not gay. But on the other hand, I do think there's much to be said for males of all kinds having affectionate relations with each other. And it doesn't have to be at all sexual. It can't really be anti-sexual, but when I was traveling in Greece a few decades ago, I not only went to places like Athens, but the small towns and villages, and always there would be one place, like typically a bar or cafe, where males of all descriptions, including very old men and including young boys and in between, would simply hang out and enjoy each other's company. And of course, it was not sexual. And that's what we've lost. I mean, for example, the men's associations in my father's and grandfather's time used to exist, like, say, the Elks Club and all of the various other male associations, have all been forced to go co-ed. And I think it's a shame. I mean, in the case of the Elks Club, my father and his friends did not really believe in all of the rigmarole and ideals of the Elks. It was just a very good space where they could be together and they could play gin rummy or pool or just gossip, whatever they wanted to do. In my hometown, the Elks Club was a grand building. It was big. It had stone glass windows, and my father taught me to play pool there in a huge room filled with regulation-side pool and billiard tables. And it took up an entire city block, I mean, with the parking lot. But after it had to become co-ed, it just dwindled, and they had to give up the building. And it now exists. This is a small town in Nebraska. It now exists as a small nondescript building. And I'm sure that, the guys don't go there to hang out and play games anymore.
John, could you talk on two levels about the harm that has been wrought by the loss of these male spaces? The two levels being the individual level for individual men and the societal level, where men have lost a sense of cohesiveness.
Well, I think it's both. It's really hard to define. I mean, I feel very strongly that gyms, for example, should be for males only. And I know that it doesn't because I interact with the other guys there. I mean, I could, do my own exercises and not necessarily talk to anybody. But as soon as there's even one female in the room, something changes. It just, the atmosphere is gone. And of course, the horrors of some of the co-ed gyms, females there wearing jewelry and makeup, and things that absolutely, completely against the idea of exercise.
It's interesting that women's statements along a similar line, that things change when a man enters a women's gym, are regarded as legit and must be honored and respected. And women must be given the space that they need. But parallel, very similar objections to the presence of women in men's spaces is regarded as Neanderthalish and chauvinistic and benighted and misogynistic.
Well, obviously, there's a double standard. I mean, I think that women also are absolutely entitled to their own women-only spaces, except that they more or less still have them, whereas we don't.
Yeah. In the days when men had spaces and had more camaraderie and they weren't bowling alone and associations among men were stronger, did we have a name for that? Was it just, buddies, male friendship? The reason I ask is because women have a name for their social affiliations. They call it the sisterhood. The sisterhood seems to have taken on an air of, political, fierceness. Do you detect that? And do men suffer by virtue of not being well organized to resist every whim and demand of the sisterhood?
It's hard to tell. I mean, of course, you could talk about the brotherhood as opposed to sisterhood. But to me, that's what it's always been. As long as there have been human societies, there have been spaces and areas where males congregated by themselves and only males.
A little while ago, you mentioned Leviticus as being the biblical basis for suppressing male-male sex. Is that right? Is that a fair statement?
Well, yeah, I would say simply that it's a taboo, and the taboo is very clearly expressed in Leviticus. But since then, the taboo ramified. I mean, it fed from all sorts of sources, religious and non-religious. So to me, that was only the original source. But I would, basically, I'm for rational sexual ethics. One of my mentors of the homophile movement, Arthur Werner, said that the gay movement was part of the unfinished business of the Enlightenment. And I think that, put it pretty well. But on the other hand, I'm not absolutely opposed to any religious support for gay rights, as long as it doesn't try to completely obscure the fact that the hostility towards sex between males is irrational, that it's a product of superstition.
So Leviticus is part of Scripture, and Scripture is part of religion. But I wonder if we could talk a bit about why the ancient Hebrews, right? Leviticus was part of the ancient Hebrew scriptures. Why did the ancient Hebrews feel a need to condemn male sex?
Well, the simple answer is I don't know. I mean, people try to speculate for these taboos and see if there's a rational reason. Taboo against certain food products or certain types of clothing or other things. And one doesn't know really, but it's partly what the taboo, well, how the taboo came to be interpreted later. And it came to be interpreted as purely and simply a taboo on males having sex with each other.
So would you be willing to go through with me a list of other possible reasons for why there is enmity between straight men and gay men in the way that straight men, some straight men, try to oppress, might be the right word, repress, ban, make it uncomfortable, discourage gay men from being gay men? Could we talk about some other possible ideas?
Well,
I have a brief list, but go ahead.
Yeah. When you get into sex, I mean, there are so many things. It isn't only a matter of the gender of the sex object. Some males are beautiful, others are ugly, some are old, some are young, some have, say, high sex drive, some have extremely low sex drives, and all of these make a difference on how sexuality is expressed or not expressed.
Yes. What is on my mind is that it really doesn't make much sense to me that straight men should find the existence and the presence of gay men in any way a problem for them individually or even as a group. How is it that straight men feel a desire, a need, an impulse, a justification, a heroism, whatever it is, to want to go up and bash gay men? And of course, not every straight man does this, but there is such a thing as a gay basher.
Well, yes. I mean, of course, for young men who are gay bashers, there's probably a lot of insecurity there. And a lot of them, have homoerotic feelings that they can't deal with. But I wouldn't say that this hostility is necessarily inherent. I think it's partly, what some men feel they're expected to do or opinions are expected to hold. But all of this can go away very quickly. I mean, if you have a good-looking young guy, put in prison, it doesn't matter how anti-gay he was before that. He may change very quickly and very easily.
Let me run through some of the, I guess you could say, hypotheses about various factors, and I'm sure there are many factors involved in an issue as complex as human sexuality. What do you think of this possibility? If I'm a young straight man, one of the things that's most important to me is that I be at least seen by straight women. And I want to make sure that when that straight woman looks at me, she at least considers the possibility that maybe I'm somebody she'd want to have a relationship with. But the problem for this young man who is hoping and wishing and trying to be visible to her and in her field of vision is that he wants to make sure that she knows he's straight. Because if she thinks he's not straight, he's not on her radar at all. So he's rejected. And to the extent that we have not very good relationships, communities between gay men and straight men. Gay men and straight men, unfortunately, sort of keep to themselves for very bad reasons, which we are sort of talking about here. If I befriend you and the woman knows that you're gay, she's at least somewhat likely to think maybe I'm gay too, which is to my disadvantage if I want to have a relationship with her. And so it's necessary for me, in at least this sense, for me to make it very clear I am no friend of John Lauritsen's, because he's gay and I'm not. What do you think? Any possibility of that being a factor?
Well, yes. I mean, I've had plenty of experiences. The females often act as sort of police. So if you're known to be gay and it's your party, there may be a thing where at least one female gets very upset if you're talking to a guy who's not gay. It's a threat to them. I can think of an example, but I mean, I've had friendships with guys who were womanizers, and in one case, females became very upset when we were seen talking to each other, and we were, good friends, and so there would seem to be a certain intimacy between them. But the female, in some cases, were very much attracted to my friend, and they were terrified that I might corrupt him just by being a friend.
You were potential competition for her desire for a relationship with him.
Well, yes, that's true also. And that Benedict Friedlander, who was one of the early movers in the German gay movement, turn of the century, wrote a lot on it. And he thought that the main forces for the condemnation of male love were females, priests, and well, I guess that was the main thing.
And so in that way, or for that purpose, it might have been in the woman's interest, it might have been her strategy to use men for violence by proxy, or discouragement by proxy. It could be in the woman's interest to get a man to do the overt gay bashing.
Well, yes, I don't think they often, openly instigate it, but sure. And it's a type of blackmail in a way. I mean, males feel they have to assert their straightness by acting out in one way or another. But let me give you one example. in about 1970, 71, there was an institution called Alternate U in New York. And it was a center for all sorts of countercultural things, everything from vegetarianism to the New Left to gay liberation, all kinds of stuff. And it was I liked it. I mean, I was quite active there. But at one point, we had a workshop for gay and straight men together. And it only had a few meetings, but it was very intense, very mellow, very nice. And the straight men particularly described, how happy they were, and how many misimpressions they'd had of what it meant to be gay. But the women, the feminists, were very, very upset. And so they had a couple of the consorts of ball-busting feminists. One would be John Stoltenberg, who was he was attracted to Andrea Dworkin. And, Ken, I forget his last name, the one of Robin Morgan, who was another vicious ball-busting feminist. And they would listen outside the door as though we were up to something, really subversive. And all sorts of crazy rumors went around. The women said that their lives were in danger, that we were plotting to attack them and cut them up in pieces and kill them and blah, blah, blah. Just utterly ridiculous things. And it became so unpleasant that we had to just stop the meetings. But the first few were quite nice.
It's worse than divide and conquer. It's don't even let them get together in the first place.
Well, yes.
Let's speak anthropologically for a second here for a possible explanation for one of the factors that might induce repression of gay men. Let's think about thousands and thousands and bazillions of years ago when the human race was a few small bands of people out on the grasslands in Africa. And there was a pretty significant imperative for the survival of the species that we make babies. And not only that we make babies, but that we nurture them and feed them and protect them and raise them. And so a man who was not necessarily interested in sex with a woman and who could not, by virtue of his desire for sex, be pledged to a woman or be attached to a woman would sort of be a waste to the tribe, because we need all of our men to be fully enlisted in the protection and the provision of the children and the women in our tribe. And so the pressure was on to require every man, whether he wanted sex or not, to be in relationship with a woman, or not even a sexual relationship with the woman, because, three guys could have impregnated all of the women in the tribe. But it's not so much about sex, it's about being willing to provide and protect. And to the extent that gay men have no need to pledge themselves to a woman to get sex in exchange for being willing to provide and protect, those men are a missed opportunity for the tribe. Does that make any sense?
Well, I would disagree with it to some extent. You're right that it's not necessary for every male to be a breeder. There could be just a few of the very best that would impregnate all of the desirable females. But I think it's collective. I think that males as a group would defend and protect women as a group, women and children as a group. I think there are survival things for, I would say, being a gay man. That's horribly anachronistic, but being able to bond males with other males, because two males who have bonded together are a far more powerful fighting force than an isolated male. And in that sense, there would be an evolutionary advantage to being able to bond effectively with other males. And as far as the, I'm trying to think of animals, but I don't think that, the whole idea of male-female pairs, the nuclear family, I don't think that there really was such a thing, way back when. I think may have been individual pairings, but I don't think it necessarily worked that way. But even in other societies, there's some where a king or some figure is basically the impregnator of a whole harem of women. And what do the other males do? Well, they have their functions too.
Including trying to sneak into the bedchamber at night.
If they wanted to, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Here's another possibility about why there is such a thing as gay bashing by straight men. Do you think there's any possibility that straight men are envious of gay men insofar as gay men don't need to play the games that straight men have to play with women for the fulfillment of their sexual wishes?
Well, I'm sure there's resentment on some level, though it's not quite fair. And that would go beyond that. The type of monogamy that's supposed to be that prevail for heterosexuals really doesn't. I mean, certainly in the 70s, there was a lot of sex that was simply sex for the sake of sex. It had nothing to do with permanent pairings or love or anything like that. It was just sex. I mean, there were the bathhouses, and in New York City, there were the piers where hundreds of thousands of men would go on a weekend. And it's not as though everyone took part in the sex, but it was there if you wanted it.
Got another possibility I'd like to run by you. Did you get a chance to read that article I sent you from the gay paper? An article I wrote back in, was it 2002 or something? Did you get a chance to read that?
I can't remember now what it was.
Okay, let me run it by you. The suggestion I made in this article was that one of the reasons that straight men don't feel particularly warmly towards gay men, and actually sometimes feel great anger and antipathy, is based on straight men's shame over male sexuality, their straight male sexuality. Now, I'm not talking about all men, but in the mating game and in the game of trying to have sex with a woman, straight men often are a bit like a door-to-door salesman. Knock, knock. I got a product I want to sell you. No, go away. I'm not interested. So these salesmen who are not terribly confident in their product develop some sleazy, manipulative sales techniques. And so men who feel the need to deploy these sleazy, manipulative sales techniques with women know that they can be effective, but they don't like it. They don't like that they do that. So that's male sexuality in their minds. And the idea that another man, a gay man, might try to use that male sexuality, those tactics, those strategies on me really enrages me, because I know how sleazy it is when I do it to a woman.
Okay, I would have a few things I would disagree with. I don't like the idea of straight male sexuality. I would just say heterosexuality.
Okay.
Because to be straight is a negative term. Of course, most gay men, you could say were bisexual, because the majority of gay men have had heterosexual experience. And a lot of married men, fathers of children, grandfathers, also, have a gay part of their, experience. And a lot of women, I think, are particularly attracted to gay men because gay men might have an attitude of, well, I can take you or leave you. Not a hard sell of themselves, okay, I'll move on. They don't necessarily say to another guy, but women can sense, that this is someone that, can take her or leave her.
Very good. I mean, that's the idea of integrity, right? I don't need you. The man is thinking, but if we get together, you'll get the real me.
Right. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another point that we wanted to talk about was that you would like to discuss the need for all male groups, publications, and spaces. We've talked about that. Also, the need to dissociate gay men from the T and the Q in LGBTQ. And you said in this email where you mentioned this wish of yours, my end goal is to emancipate male love from superstition and intolerance. So talk to me about the T and the Q in LGBTQ and how you'd like to dissociate.
Well, the T would be transgenderism, and I regard that, it's virtually a juggernaut now. It's scary. People have had their lives ruined if they use the wrong pronoun or if they refuse to say that there's a difference between a woman and a castrated man. And to me, this is simply a matter of truth, reality. But on another level, to me, the gay liberation movement was a movement to liberate sexuality. And the transgender thing is, at the core, is anti-sexual. Especially when you get into surgery or the chemical castration things. Nobody could refer to castration as simply reassigning sexuality. If you take a dog to the veterinarian to be spayed, she's being desexed. I could say that my cat Milky is a male to female transsexual and that the operation was performed by a veterinarian. But of course, that's manifestly ridiculous. But no, I'm completely opposed to the transgender thing. And what's so vicious is that they're trying to say little boys, 5 years old or even younger, know their identity enough that they're really women in, in a male body, a female soul in a male body. And that's quite ridiculous, but they are putting these little boys on chemicals which will prevent them from going through puberty, chemical form of castration. And the chemicals are terribly injurious. They stunt the growth, they lower the IQ. But they did a study, actually several studies, of boys who thought that they really were females, and they just did nothing. And by the time they had gone through adolescence and all of that, 80% of them were perfectly happy to be the sex they were born. In other words, the boys were happy to be boys. I think that's a human rights issue, and I think that the therapists and the physicians that are taking part in, the puberty blocking of little boys should be thrown in, brought to justice. They belong in prison.
Is this happening? Is this intervention, sex reassignment efforts, are they being visited more upon little boys than little girls?
Well, I don't know the exact number, but it appears to be much more, directed to boys than girls. I mean, there've always been tomboys, but nobody mentioned tomboy. Nobody had anything against tomboys. That was always a part of life, and people sort of liked them. And a lot of the tomboys grew up, and they were still tomboys in a way, but they got married and they became good mothers.
Yeah, I remember liking the tomboys in my neighborhood. They were sort of cool. So, John, you've talked about your unhappiness with the idea of taking kids, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, really young kids, and reassigning their sex. Do you recognize, is there any situation for adults where sex reassignment is, in your view, understandable, valuable, beneficial, not to be condemned?
Well, part of me is a libertarian, and I could say people can do what they want with their body. But on the other hand, there's medical practice. And I think that surgeons who perform any of these change of sex thing should lose their licenses and perhaps be thrown in prison. There's no justification for it. I mean, this is, if anything, a psychological issue, but it's not as though they really did have a female soul in a male body. I mean, that's mystical nonsense.
Okay. All right.
You wanted to talk about the Q, the queer thing.
Yes.
Well, this is, to me, so obvious it can hardly be discussed. I mean, it's like using the N word. I hardly dare to use it now. I mean, but as saying that blacks should not only regard it as a good word, but you should not mind it if everybody else used the N word, and that would be regarded as perfectly obvious bigotry. But queer was always probably the most hateful word in the American language to apply to gay men, or perhaps to anybody. And about 1980 or so, there was a sudden movement to reclaim queer, which was perfectly absurd because you never reclaim something. It always belonged to your enemies. But it's a combination of whatever the forces are that hate gay men, along with a few muddle-headed academics, and maybe a few self-hating gay men that have endorsed the use of queer. But certainly my friends and certainly everybody I ever knew from the homophile movement would be absolutely horrified at the idea that queer would be accepted, that you'd have like a queer theories conference or course.
It's the word itself, it's the epithet itself that bothers you.
Well, and not only the fact that it was a hateful word, but also the core meanings. What does queer mean? Well, it means obviously inauthentic, devious, bent. I forget exactly all of the meanings, but the core dictionary meanings to me should not apply to gay men.
The Q in LGBTQ can also be said to be the initial for the word questioning, right?
It could, but that's sophistry. I mean, that was, not what was meant by adding the Q to it.
Okay. Let me run one more idea by you regarding this idea of Q. Questioning. Do you think there is much to be said for the possibility that, I know that some gay men are born gay. They are gay in utero. But do you think that there are some boys who were questioning who they were and what their sexuality was, not so much because they identified with gayness, but rather because they disidentified with, I know you think the word is problematic, but they disidentified with straightness. That a little boy who gets the idea through a bazillion media messages and interpersonal relationships that to be a straight man is to be lots of things that this little boy would find abhorrent. And so thinks, well, I guess I'm not straight. I guess there's this alternate life that I could adopt. I guess I must be gay. Does that ring any truth bells for you?
It could, although I think that what happens in puberty, especially from boys that are going to be very gay, but to some extent all of them, is that they appreciate the sexuality of male bodies. And this differs. The boys with high sex drives, it would be more so. And that was the one difference that Kinsey found between males who were to some extent on the gay end of the continuum and the males who were completely straight, is that the gay man, which would be like, say 2 through 6 on this scale, had a higher sexual substrate or sex drive. And on the whole, this is positive. Somebody with a high sexual substrate is on the average more intelligent, healthier, live longer, and other things. But I think, well, to me, basically, to go to the heart of it, I regard male homoerotic responsiveness among males to be a phylogenetic characteristic of our species. I think it's inherent in most, if not all, males. And I think it has some survival value, or it would not have existed that way. But I regard it basically as something that is inherent, and not just in a minority, but in virtually all males.
Can you suggest some possibilities for what the survival advantage might be?
Well, as I said before, that two men who have bonded together are a far more powerful unit than an isolated gay man.
Okay. And a sexual experience cements the bond even deeper.
It does, although it may not necessarily be necessary. well, that it may not, yeah.
So what about a survival advantage for female sexuality? Would there be any thoughts about that being phylogenetic?
Well, I think there's a advantage for females who are able to bond with each other, sexually or not. I mean, obviously, a woman who cannot bond with other females would be unpopular and become, more isolated. Yeah.
Okay, because women often raise their kids in a communal setting, helping each other at the playground, for instance.
Yes, and of course, hundreds of thousands of years ago, I mean, I imagine things were a great deal more communal than they are now.
Yeah. So, John, the last item on our list of things we wanted to talk about, and I might have wanted to talk about this more than you did, I'm not sure. I hope you like the idea too. But we talked about the possibility of having some kind of an overt collaboration of friendship and mutual support between gay men and heterosexual men. We talked about, maybe I'm the one who talked about this more than you did, but you talked about the fact that camp, the style of comedy known as camp, is particularly embraced or adaptable to the life situations of gay men. Maybe I should ask you to talk a bit about camp, the style of comedy that it is, and why it seems to be so well embraced by gay men.
Well, right. The understanding of camp was, to some extent, spoiled by an essay by Susan Sontag, who I regard as one of the silliest pseudo, intellectuals of the century. But her essay on camp, in a way, was anti-gay and completely missed the point. And the best parts of it were not even original with her. But to me, camp is a form of humor which involves somewhat stylization, somewhat theatrical, sort of over the top. But it makes humor out of the oppression of gay men. I'm not sure, well, it's making humor out of danger, out of oppression. I can't think of offhand. I mean, Oscar Wilde, of course, is a brilliant example of camp. Well, I don't, I really can't think of good examples right now, but it's something that, to the extent that it depends upon making humor out of the situation gay men are in, which is a situation of condemnation and all of the rest of it. I mean, you can have things that seem campy, theatrical and all of that, which are not gay. It could be a type of humor for anybody. But I think the heart of real camp is the humor of gay men.
So to use camp and camp, to use comedy of the camp genre as an opportunity for gay men and heterosexual men to work together and explore what we have in common and develop bonds and friendship and mutual support for each other. It's probably not likely that, Joe Sixpack, the very traditional man, to be willing to participate in a camp comedy troupe with gay men. But I wondered, do you know of the group of men? It's not really a movement, it's not an organization, but it's sort of a sentiment. Do you know the sentiment among men called MGTOW, MGTOW?
Oh, men going their own way?
Yes.
Somewhat familiar with it, yes.
The reason they come to mind is because like gay men, they are not interested in pursuing relationships with women. That's what they have in common. Now, what they have not in common is that gay men don't really care about relationships with women. MGTOW men really do. And they would really like if the world were different so that they could have the kinds of relationships with women that they would like to have, which I think are essentially relationships with women in which they could maintain some sense of personal integrity. And MGTOW men are just very, very much not interested in kissing women's butts, if I, could put it into a phrase. So there's ways in which MGTOW men and gay men are different, but there are ways in which MGTOW men and gay men are very similar. And, the similarities might be more similar than we think, because what's one of the reasons that gay men are oppressed? One of the reasons might be because they're not interested in serving women. What's one of the reasons that MGTOW men are regarded as scum of the earth by some people? Because they're not interested in serving women. I wonder if that could be a genre of humor that would help to, illuminate what's really going on with men between men, men among men, and also men as a group with women as a group.
Well, that covers a lot. I think in general that there's a great need for a men's movement, which there, are some, men's movement now, but that, all men could take part, and where sexuality would not really be it, but it would involve everything from divorce settlements, from the oppression of little boys in grade school, which Christina Hoff Sommers wrote a marvelous book on that, The War Against Boys. It would be against the poisoning of little boys with Ritalin, because they fidget in their classes because they're bored out of their mind. And often the most intelligent boys are the worst fidgeters and the ones that get poisoned, because they're bored, with the class, and they aren't given the exercise that they need. I think there are many. Well, Warren Farrell wrote a book which I reviewed on, I forget what the title was exactly. It was basically on men's rights. I forget the title. But he goes into a lot of issues, and I think most of those issues, which are injustice against males, should be, should be fought by, men together, regardless of whether they're gay, straight, or in between.
So when I think of the men's movement and the possibility that men might unite to deal with these issues, one of the organizations that comes to mind is NOMAS, National Organization for Men Against Sexism. Now, I don't know what percentages are, but there are a fair number of gay men in NOMAS. And they talk a lot. NOMAS is a very pro-feminist group, by the way. And they talk a lot about the patriarchy. And so I think what you're suggesting is that there are a lot of gay men who are not necessarily feminist, who are very male, very much appreciate male values, maleness, male beauty, male principles, male ethics, just male styles of being in the world, who might be very good allies for those of us in the men's movement who want to address issues such as the ones you just cataloged, the obvious ones being divorce. Do you think that's true? Is there a chance that there are gay men who are not going to say, oh, no, you're a men's rights activist and we need to smash the patriarchy, so you're my enemy?
Well, there ought to be. I'm not sure there are very many now. I mean, there's a type of politically correct gay orthodoxy, and it would be basically feminist. I mean, talking about the patriarchy and all of that. But I think that should change. I think there should be gay voices that, go far beyond the politically correct gay line at the moment.
And you think of any way in which I, as a straight man, heterosexual man, can take it upon myself as my responsibility, not responsibility, but my opportunity? Is there some way that I could successfully, actively, productively reach out to gay men and say, come on, we got so much in common. Let's work together. Is there something I could do? Is there a channel, a medium? Is there an opportunity?
Well, good question. At this point, there may be such voices. I don't know them, publications or whatever. I really don't know. Ideally, there should be in the gay publications, there should be a dialogue on such things, but I don't see a dialogue. I see mostly just variations on the orthodoxy.
The mob.
Well, whatever. Yes.
Okay. John, thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking about you, talking with you. Well, about you too. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the show. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Men Are Talking. Did we deliver? Did you hear something that made you think, wow, I never thought of it like that? Let us know. If we did, tell your friends.